Hey everybody, it's Tom the ColourBlind Quilter here, and I'm here with part 2 of my quilting collab with Kristen from Scrap Fabric Love. Now, if you have not seen part 1 of this series on Kristen's channel, there is a link in the description below where you can go ahead and watch that and find out what we have been up to. But I'm going to give you a quick recap just so that you can follow along with the rest of this video. So Kristen and I have been quilty friends for a little while. We met together in the Edinburgh Modern Quilt Guild, and Kristen has a fabulous YouTube channel called Scrap Fabric Love, and we're both going to the Festival of Quilts in Birmingham in August, which we're really excited about. Now, for those of you who have not been to that, it's like the UK equivalent of QuiltCon in America, and they have competition where you can enter quilts, and there are loads of different categories. So Kristen said to me, hey, do you fancy entering a quilt into the 2-person category? We could do something together. And what she wanted to do was combine her scrappy improv style quilting with my more modern traditional quilting style and do kind of a quilting call and response. And how it would work is that I would make a traditional block or traditional piece, and then that was me calling Kristen, and then Kristen would respond by making some kind of improv scrappy style piece back. And so after a little bit of planning and discussion, we decided that the medallion style quilts is actually one of the best ways to do this, because how everything goes in round, it would be very easy for us to do the call and response. So I kicked it off with a center block, a traditional center block, and then the plan was to show that to Kristen so that she could then come up with some kind of improv scrappy style corners squares to go around my center block. Then I would do the next round, and then Kristen would do the corners, and then she would do the next round and I would do the corners, and then finally I would do the last outside round corners and Kristen would do the last outside round pieces. So we had a Zoom call to plan things out and to figure it out, because when you're making a quilt on your own, as you probably know, it's easy because you just adjust the sizes and things as you go. But when you're doing something with somebody else, we needed to make sure that we knew what size of pieces we were making so that the next round was the right size and would fit. And so we had this Zoom call, and the plan was to work out the maths. Now, I love quilty maths. It's one of the fun parts for me when it comes to designing and planning a quilt. I love working out all the fabric and how to be the most efficient and get the most out of the fabric strips that I'm cutting. But something that was just not coming from my brain was working out the finished size of a square block that was going to be set on point with corner triangle. My brain was like, no. Bye-bye. And so after ages of Googling and looking at websites and things like that, my partner said, oh, isn't that just Pythagoras' theorem for triangles, that you work out the size and then you get that? So we did that, and we worked out the size across the square, so then we would know how to work out the size of the corner squares and go on it. Following? Because it's kind of confusing. So we got the size, and I used that from a calculator on a website to work out the size of the corner square triangles, and spoiler alert, it was wrong. Not the maths was wrong, Pythagoras' theorem was correct, but in my haste to figure it out, I read wrong and read for the set in the squares and not the corner triangle. Now there is a difference, okay? So if you've never made a quilt on point before, there are squares that are cut and go down the sides of the quilt to make it a rectangle so that it straightens the edges up, and then there are squares that get cut into 4 that go on the corners, and what that does is it finishes the rectangle. So I ended up trying again and getting myself thoroughly confused. So we had a 40-minute phone call where we just figured it out ourselves, and then the rest of the maths fell into place, and that was it. We were ready to go. Now in part 1 you will already have seen that there was a fabric pool that I had put together that was bright solid colors and quite a cheerful looking palette. So I was ready to get designing, so I went straight to pre-quilt and started setting myself up the medallion style quilt and my center block, and then all the pieces that I was going to do. And then I went and got my Encyclopedia of Quilt Blocks, which is a fabulous book, and I went through it and picked about a dozen squares that I thought would look really interesting and really nice in the center of the quilt. And the thing that you have to remember when you're doing this is that in the book, in all books, the blocks are square, but I needed to make sure that it looked good on point, because some of them that I picked, it's like, well, that's lovely. As soon as you put it on point, the effect of the block was lost. So I spent a lot of time sitting like this with the book at odd angles, just making sure that it was going to work on point. So I sat down in pre-quilt and started designing that center block, got it in the quilt, and then I thought, just so I don't get confused with blank spaces, I'm going to make all the parts that Kristen is making, I'm going to make them black, which actually turned out to be a wonderful thing, because Kristen's blocks, she used black denim as the background for them. So actually, that kind of little thought was really helpful, because I got to see how the contrast of the black against what I was doing worked. So I designed and I played and I tweaked and I put stuff together and then took it out. And the fun thing is that there's no right or wrong here because I don't know what Kristen's doing. So kind of anything goes. And as long as I felt like my pieces all had some kind of central theme in them, they would kind of feel coherent and together and that they were meant to be part of the quilt. And the center block that I picked was heavily based on half square triangles. I knew that half square triangles had to feature in the other parts of the quilt. But the problem I have when it comes to digital designing is that it's so easy to come up with these amazing shapes and bits and everything like that. And it's very difficult to remember that I actually have to make this out of fabric afterwards. And so I got a little bit carried away with my first block or my first border piece. So anyway, I got to the end of the day, had something in pre-quilt, slept in it, came back the next day, decided I hated it, redid it all, slept in it and decided that actually I really liked what I had done the second round and it worked really nicely and the colours were in the right places and everything was coming together. So it was time to do my quilty maths for my quilt pieces. And for the pieces that I picked, because it was so heavily half square triangle centred, the tweaks that I made from the first round of design to the second round of design was to introduce some more blocky elements. So the centre square is very half square triangle heavy, and then that's echoed in my first round half square triangles. But then I wanted to break that up while still giving a nod to the half square triangle. So I went with some just very simple square blocks that just added a little bit of movement along my pieces. And it actually allowed me to tie one of my rounds with my corner squares of the previous round so that it felt, as I said, coherent and that it was supposed to be part of the same quilt. So after about 15 minutes, I had all my quilty maths worked out, all the strips, all the pieces, all the bits that I needed to cut, ready to go. And it always amazes me because in your head, and I don't know if this is the same for everybody, but in my head, I always think, oh, it's going to take ages to cut all this stuff out. And then you whiz through and you're like, oh, well, that really wasn't very bad at all. So it took me about 20 minutes to cut all of the pieces out and then label them. And what I did was I cut them and then labeled them and grouped them by the section that I was making so that I could pick up a section and then sew it to completion and then that section was done and then move on to the next section. I probably could have done it where it was more efficient to do all the half square triangles for all the bits, but you know, I have a habit of mixing things up and sewing things the wrong way. So that kind of felt like it was a bit dangerous, especially since this is a competition entry and I wanted things to be as crisp as possible. And in fact, it actually took me longer to make the half square triangles. I had 120 half square triangles to make just for the first two parts of this quilt than it did to do all the math and the cutting. So it just goes to show just how quickly you can power through things, you know, when you're just getting on with it. So I made my center block, it turned out perfectly. I was really happy with it. All the seams were lovely and crisp, all the things were matching and lining up in the right place. So I sent it off to Kristen so that she could see what I had done and then she could start to think about what her corner triangles were going to be. And then I carried on and started my next row. And this is where I realized that my digital creativity was going to come back and bite me in the bum because the block that I had designed was very heavily made of half square triangles. And then just to add insult to injury, I had snowballed the half square triangle block. So each of these blocks is made up of 4 half square triangles and each of those 4 half square triangles has a snowball on it. So the amount of seams on the back was starting to get ridiculous for one block. Then when you factor out that I had to put 4 of them together for each of my sections, there was so much seams to deal with. But it didn't actually take that long to make 64 half square triangles, doing it 2 at a time, and then trimming them, and then doing the snowballs, and then trimming and pressing. So it didn't actually take me that long. And I even actually managed to be proactive and press some one way and some the other way, so that when it came to putting the blocks together, I was going to be able to nest my seams because I really wanted this to be really crisp, my points to show, and I really wanted it to try and get it to lay as flat as possible. But there's just so much bulk when you put half square triangles together, especially with the snowballs, and some of the seams just did not want to go together because of the bulk, and the sewing machine either has a problem or just was not liking the bulk, and so things kept getting shoved out of sync. So I had to do a lot of unpicking and putting back together to get it to the point where I was happy with it. And I smashed the proverbial crap out of those seams with that iron, ready to get hammer out at one point to get them nice and flat. And I can honestly say I don't think I've ever sewn so slow and been so picky and unpicked so many things when doing a quilt. Usually I'm very much of the it's good enough, you know, family, but this I was really particularly picky with it. But still, I got everything done. I was pretty happy with it. It did actually look really good in the end, so I was pleased it was worth the effort. It was a little wobbly in places, but there was, I mean, I could unpick and unpick and unpick and be there all day and to the point where the fabric was shredding, or I could just accept that it was about a 7 out of 10 and it was good enough at that stage. You know, I didn't see the value of unpicking for a 7th time for just to turn out the same way again, because it literally just was not going to come together the way that I wanted it to. So I just you know, that's good enough, let's move on. Now then my next row was emulating that half square triangle design from the first one. And I thought, oh, here we go again. But I only actually had to make 4 of them. So it was only 16 half square triangles and 8 snowball. I whizzed through them and I had learned so much doing the first round that I got them really nice and flat, really nice and nested together. And actually, I think they probably turned out a lot better than the first round because I had learned so much doing the first round with all those half square triangles. Everything else, the square blocks were a piece of cake. You know, it was just sewing rectangles together, which is, you know, dead easy, and everything nested and looking beautiful. And so everything went great until I got to the final outside round where I was making the outside corners of the quilt. And again, this is where that digital creativity versus what you can do in reality with your skills came into play, because what I had designed looked great, but when I was looking at it, I was like, how on earth am I going to make this? And the thing is, when I make blocks, I hate fabric wastage. I don't mind trimming up, you know, HSTs and squaring things up. That's fine because that's just a necessary part. But when it comes to, you know, making something bigger and then cutting little bits out, like fussy cutting and all that stuff, I hate the fabric wastage because it makes these weird bits of fabric that don't really work or fit with anything else. And I'm not really a crumb scrappy quilter, so I end up just carrying them around in boxes and bags for years, not knowing what to do with them, but don't want to throw them away because it's a waste, you know. So I try and avoid that as much as possible. And I spent at least 3 hours trying to engineer a way to make this block by sewing rectangles and then adding half of half square triangles and snowballing and sashes and seams. And I said, oh, okay, look, it's 4 blocks. It's not that much fabric. We'll make it as small as it possibly can so that there's as little wastage as possible. But we've got to get this done. We cannot spend a whole day just on these 4 blocks. And so in the end, the way that I figured out how to do was basically to make what looked like the bottom of a house, you know, like you would draw in school, like a rectangle with a square door, you know, door in it. I then took a half square triangle, sewed a strip on it, and then sewed that to the rectangle bed. Then took a 6-inch square and cut out what I wanted, grimaced at the wastage, and then just moved on. And actually, it turned out great, and I was really happy with it. And I felt I had done everything I could to try and not waste the fabric, which was important to me. So I felt like I could live with the little bit of wastage that I got. And so I was finished all my bits. I was like, yay, finished. And so decided to send them over to Kristen so that she could see for her next round what I'd done so that she could respond. And it was at this stage, whilst confirming everything, that we realized that somewhere along the lines we had got our wires crossed. And I had thought that we were making 6.5-inch blocks. But Kristen thought that we were making 6-inch blocks. So Kristen had made bits that were 6 inches, and it wasn't really going to be easy for her to add the extra 1/2 inch to it. I mean, like, she'd have to add a 1/2 inch strip of denim to the pieces that she had made. So I said, well, okay, fair enough. I will just trim mine down to 6 inches. It's going to be easier and less pain for me than it is for you to try and re-engineer everything that you've done. So I had to unpick everything that I had done, and I did my blocky one bit here, and that was fine because I could just trim it. I had, you know, there was no points or anything that were going to get cut off. The corner outside blocks, my little houses that I made, they were okay. They trimmed down and I still got the effect that I wanted, so that was fine. And then I got to my first round, which was my really heavy HST kind of rick-rack border, and was like, oh, this is great because actually I think trimming this down to 6 inches is going to hide some of those wobbly bits. And so actually this might be a benefit, a blessing in disguise. So I picked it apart, and then I started measuring and working out how I was going to trim it, because I wanted to make sure I did not lose the points at the top and bottom. So I needed to make sure that when I trimmed, when they sewed back in, there was still going to be the points, because then that really would look bad. So I figured it out. I took my time with it, and it's important not to rush something like that, because the whole effect comes from how the points meet at the top and how they meet at the bottom. And so if I just chopped all that off, it would have been a bit of a disaster. And this is where I had my duh moment. When I had worked out my maths and worked out my sizes for this particular block, I had worked it out so that the block would finish 6 inches. So when 2 blocks were being joined together like this, the seam allowance meant that the points would match and you would get these perfect V's where the snowballs were. And so that all went to pot, because I cut and trimmed the block down. And so I hummed and hawed and hummed and hawed. And what did I do? Did I just remake it from scratch? Shall I make another 120 half square triangles and do this all again? Or did I just try and make it look like it's supposed to be like that? I even thought about inserting little strips of fabric in between to kind of space it out so that it wouldn't be as obvious. So, you know, I kind of jigged and played and poked and prodded it as much as I could, and then I had to just put it together and hope for the best. And I think there were 16 of those blocks, and I think for about 13 out of the 16 it was okay. You couldn't tell that it was obviously something wrong, but there was 3 where just something was not quite right, and I sort of unpicked them, put them back together, but I couldn't get them done. Now, it was at this stage where I was starting to feel the pressure, because we thought that the 15th of July was the deadline to submit the picture of your finished quilt, so it could be included in the website, and then we still had weeks to post the actual quilt, because by this stage all we had were strips and pieces. We did not have a finished quilt top. And it was at that point where Kristen realised that actually the quilt had to be in Birmingham by the 15th of July. So that means the quilt had to be sewn together into the quilt top, sandwiched and quilted and bound and trimmed and photographed and shipped. And this was the 12th of July that we were on. And so we had planned a nice day. We'd get together, we'd, check everything, check the sizes, sew it all together, have a lovely kind of, sewing session. And then we'd have time to, think about quilting design, see what worked. And, So yeah, there was a lot of pressure on. We basically had to make a quilt top and quilt it and finish it in a day. And it didn't quite go according to plan, but Kristen's going to tell you about that in part 3. But thankfully I had the foresight that I had finished about 15 minutes earlier than I was expecting to finish before a meeting. So I had the foresight to cut my binding pieces and quickly sew them together. So I was organised, and that really helped. Because when it came down to that point of having to do the binding, when there was, hours to get it in the post, it really helped being organised. So to get to that day though at Kristen's house, there was a lot of swearing and a few late nights and a lot of kind of head scratching and thinking, why is this not working? And then just, picking it apart and doing it again. But would I do it again? Absolutely. Because it was so much fun, and I'm looking forward to doing it again next year. Just a little bit more organised for time though. So just to kind of recap though, like what the things that I've taken away from this whole process of making my pieces and working with a partner when you don't know what your partner's doing for a quilt, is to definitely know the deadline that the quilt is due. That's number 1 on the list. The second is perhaps to have a project sheet that stipulates all the sizes and everything on paper that you and your partner have in advance of making or cutting anything, so that you know what you're doing basically. And then I think this project really kind of brought home to me that what it looks like on digital tools and what you can make in reality can sometimes be very different. And I'm sure, that there are many, many experienced quilters that could take anything digital and make it with enough time and effort. But for me, I want to, in future, think about when I'm reviewing it, because what I like to do when I design a quilt is I like to do it and then sleep on it and then come back to it, make a copy of it and then play with it so that I've still got the original that I can reference and I don't lose by changing. So I think when I do that, what I want to come back and say is like, okay, how will I make this bit? How much fabric wastage will it create? How much bulk will this have on the back? Are there too many seams here that this is not going to nest or fit through the sewing machine? So that's something I'm going to try and incorporate into my quilt review and design process, is that can I make it, basically. And then finally, just remember to breathe, because I find myself holding my breath as I'm sewing stuff together, especially when I'm really like, oh, what's it going to match? And then you're like, oh, wait, I feel a bit lightheaded, need to breathe. So breathing is also helpful. But as I said, I had so much fun despite all the ups and downs. It was so much fun, and I was really looking forward to the day sewing with Kristen, even though we were under pressure. And sometimes they say the best things come from being under a deadline and being under pressure, because when you've got loads of time, you just faff around and waste time. But when you're on a deadline, you just got to get it done. So, maybe perhaps it was a blessing in disguise. Now, as I mentioned, part 3 is going to be on Kristen's channel, Scrap Fabric Love, and that's going to come out on the 30th of July 2024. And I will leave links in the description to the part 1 of this series, and you'll want to make sure you subscribe to her channel so that you can see part 3 when it comes out. And part 4 of the series is going to be on my channel, and it's going to be the grand reveal of the quilt at the Festival of Quilts, which at the time of recording this is a week today. I'll be going there, but I will know in about 5 days time if we've won anything at the competition or not. So I'm excited. I'll be sitting waiting for the phone to ring all day. So yeah, that's part 2 of a Quilty collab with Kristen from Scrap Fabric Love. So I hope you've enjoyed that and seeing some of my thoughts and design processes that go into making a quilt. I'd love to hear from you though in the comments. Have you made a group quilt, or have you entered a kind of 2-person category where you've been designing a quilt together, and how did you handle the process? Did you know what each other was making, or had you decided in advance, or have you done the improv where it's totally secret until it's made? So I'd love to hear from your experiences of doing group quilts and group projects. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to get notified, and if you liked the video, maybe give it a little thumbs up. And in the description are all the links to Kristen's channel in part 1, and then I'll see you in part 4 at Festival of Quilts. So take care, and I'll see you soon.